Jesteśmy już gotowi, aby rozpocząć.
Okay, we're ready to start the second part of the second date of our Europass Euroguidance Educational Forum. I'd like to welcome our internet audience. I hope you joined us already. Our speaker is also ready, so I would like to request all the interested participants to come back, finish their coffee, finish their discussions, because we're starting the second round of speeches. Our guest will be Jacek Lewicki of the Warsaw School of Economics, and the title of his presentation is Micro-Credentials as a lifelong learning tool. Dr. Lewicki, do you hear us? Can you see us? Yes. I'm connected. Okay, we can hear you. Let me present you one more time. Dr. Jacek Lewicki of Warsaw School of Economics, Warsaw. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize for connecting with you remotely. I was unable to attend the conference in person, but I believe the hybrid version will be sufficient. I was asked to make a general presentation of micro-credentials, sometimes in Polish referred to as micro-certifications, in the context of lifelong learning. And I would like to present European perspective and our domestic experience of the team assisting the Minister of Education and Science, and we focus on micro-credentials in the context of higher education. So these are the pillars of my today's presentation. I hope you can see my screen. I'm not able to verify this. I do not have an overview. I'll try one more time. Now you should be able to see my screen. Okay, there's a slight time delay, but okay, we'll talk about micro-credentials as a tool for lifelong learning. To start with, we need to summarize the three dimensions of lifelong learning. And first of all, there's a vertical dimension, so we follow specific levels of successive levels of formal education. Then horizontal, so there is a perspective of development of different interests, and not necessarily connected with formal education. And the third one is in-depth, so it's self-development and satisfying an individual's intellectual interests. So in this context, we are most frequently discussing vocational education and training, which in Europe is divided into two kinds. One is the initial VET. In Poland, it's mainly focused on education in vocational and technical high schools, and the second part is continuous vocational education. But as you can see, it is a somewhat broader context than just a continuous education once the formal educational path is completed. Okay, so I will now elaborate on the micro-credentials context. Actually, two terms can be used. The English version is micro-credentials and micro-certifications, a Polish equivalent. There was some discussion about the terms. We were thinking how to translate micro-credentials to Polish, and in official documents of the European Commission, micro-certifications certifications term was adopted in order to distinguish between formal qualifications, which have some more requirements imposed. So the term micro-credentials is used in the context of higher education, and in other areas, other terms also appear, which are quite similar to the definition of micro-credentials, and I will tell you what this definition is. So we may come across different terms designated digital badges, open badges, and I will have there will be another presentation by Michał Stever. But okay, we can also hear about different certificates. We also refer to different credentials and certificates, or micro-qualification. It's a term that we use in the Polish definition. But in fact, the European Commission brings attention to the fact of what a micro-credential is, and that is the basis to separate it from a micro-credential from a micro-certificate. First of all, it's supposed to be a documentation that certifies the outcomes of learning, which needs to be transparent and needs to comply with certain clearly defined standards. So here, of key significance is the element of knowledge, competencies and skills, which reminds qualifications, but in a way it combines the world of micro-credentials with the qualification framework. And the European Commission says that micro-credentials should respond to social, personal, cultural and labor market needs. So it is not only limited to the labor market needs, but although it seems most natural and useful in that context. So summing up the definition of micro-certifications or micro-credentials developed in cooperation with the European Commission, it needs to be an independent document and form part of a larger credential. And also it needs to be based on a quality assurance procedure and certain agreed standards. So we need to remember that not all elements, given the names that we mentioned, will actually serve as micro-credentials. So open badges will be able to stand or to represent micro-credentials, but they may also serve as micro-certificates. So micro-certificates will form a special element that will fulfill certain minimum requirements, and that will also require developing mutual trust between institutions that award and actually honor specific micro-certificates. So I would like to discuss the major assumptions, European assumptions, which result from the definition. So what is a micro-credential? What is micro-credential made of, and what is it? What is the purpose of a micro-credential? It's meant to enable everyone who studies something to acquire, update, and improve their knowledge, skills, and competencies. I believe in the Polish system we would also refer to social competencies, actually predominantly social competencies, and the assumption is also for the micro-credentials to support the willingness of providers to improve the quality, transparency, flexibility and reliability of the issuing body, but it's also meant as a promoting, as an element which extends an educational offer, and I will mention more. This element should also promote social inclusion and accessibility to trustworthy and verified competencies and skills. What is worth mentioning is the aspect of mobility. Micro-credentials are meant to reinforce, to strengthen mobility of learners. In education, we sometimes mention that certain people are not able to use mobility throughout one semester, so maybe a smaller time span could also be significant, like with Erasmus students. It's also meant to support social inclusiveness or social inclusion for social groups who, due to certain living conditions, are not able to dedicate time to get a full qualification. So now I would like to move on and discuss the elements that form a micro-credential. So first of all, it should include a learner identification. It has to also mention the title, the name, the issuing authority, the issuing date, but also the learning outcomes. And that is a very important element because it ensures comparability. But also, it should mention the workload level required to achieve the learning outcomes. But of course, it's conditional because some learners acquire their qualifications faster, some do that at a slower pace, but it also results from different living conditions, different living life situations. But also, the same formal qualification may be secured in different ways. You can attend courses, training sessions, or you can simply take an external exam and rely on your own studying. So it's always an estimation. Another element is the level. And it's another important aspect, so that an educational experience can be referred to qualification framework, so that everybody can get a picture of what a given qualification stands for and what kind of skills it represents, and can it form part of a certain qualification? Can it be used on account of some other formal qualification? And the last part is type of assessment, so how it will be verified. Other forms, other elements include a form of participation in educational experience. So this may be a course, but also experience may be gained by working or by engaging in other activities. And yet another element is quality assurance, which distinguishes as a given certificate from all other documents and certificates. And some additional elements, if applicable or if necessary for a given micro-credential. I listed them here. So that includes option of integration or connecting options in order for the learner to obtain a market or a formal qualification. So here I'd like to mention one other initiative, namely individual training accounts. In 2022, the Council of European Union adopted a recommendation on individual training accounts, and they are intended to be used as a collection and use of training entitlements, and allocation of certain amount of funds for training. The limits of funds can be increased in case of people with special learning, special educational needs. And they should also be used to promote participation in not just formal education, with namely acquiring market qualifications, but also to confirm informal education or non-formal education. It should also be used as encouragement to issue micro-credentials. So you can see that the micro-credentials in combination with individual training accounts may become another tool to facilitate increasing your qualifications of employees or people who are unemployed. What deserves to be mentioned is that in this context, the individual training accounts require certain adjustment or adaptation. First of all, the sources of funding need to be diversified, both public and private. Also, the support system may be changed. A Polish actor could be the National Training Fund, which, it needs to be mentioned, is not fully used so far. And this indicates that there is a great potential to increase the efficiency of the tool. These funds have to be paid by employers anyway. It's a compulsory contribution. They have to be designated for that person. So the National Training Fund could be used in a more effective way, which was also emphasized by the Supreme Chamber of Audit. And now, when we secure funding, public and private, we will need to create a good and comprehensive educational offer, which will be reliable as well. So this should also be linked or related to the European guidelines and to solutions which simplify or facilitate verification of competencies in a non-formal and informal way. So what is our experience to date? Well, first of all, the Ministry of Education and Science has an advisory panel, which used to be called a panel for micro-credentials, but given the scope of work of that panel that I'm a member of, we decided that it would be more applicable to call ourselves advisory panel on micro-credentials, because the scope of our work applies to what micro-credentials are in the understanding of the European Union regulations. So we focused on the fact that we have numerous examples of activities which could be micro certificates, micro credentials. And here I mean transitional competencies, soft competencies, which could be very well used on the labor market, and they are usually acquired outside of the main curriculum or main programs of studies. For instance, they are such skills may be offered by sports clubs or cultural clubs or charity activities, charity organizations. So these are all kinds of activities that improve students' competencies, social competencies, which are not formally reflected in a given school's curriculum. And that may be regulated by the program of micro-credentials. Another thing is modules or parts of curriculum or programs of studies which are which cover competencies covering a certain professional area, which are negligent or are not emphasized in a given program of studies. They may also be elements or skills that are gained during internship programs, and they may be better emphasized or in a given certificate. We also mentioned the lifelong learning, programs. For instance, there's different types of universities. Universities for children, universities for senior citizens. We need to remember that schools of higher education also offer postgraduate studies, doctoral studies, but also they propose different kinds of courses and training sessions which are not which do not fall under the category of higher education, but they may be requested by specific industry sectors or actually companies. So this covers certificates and industry qualifications acquired thanks to a communication between schools of higher educations and certain organizations. So this way, students may gain some additional qualifications or, for instance, be exempted from participating in certain courses when they get certification recognized on the market. So this could facilitate and make it more flexible. Right now, such additional activities that students may be involved in are only included in diploma supplement. So, but that's very theoretical and very simplified. So, if we were able to issue micro-credentials, that would be more concrete, more relevant. And the use of micro-credentials could also be used in developing modules of programs of studies. So in this way, certain modules could form independent parts in the program of studies, which could be a standalone modules, and that would facilitate studying two different majors.
And any open source education programs or training like MOOCs program. And the experience shows that short programs that do not offer as part of formal and non-formal education are much more flexible and convenient for employees. So MOOC platforms have not brought the revolution that was announced a couple of years ago, but they are still quite popular, and the pandemic has shown the need to improve this form of online training. Activity of non-governmental organizations can also be included and certified by micro-credentials. The same is true about activity in cultural institutions, sports institutions, or international corporations, which use internal motivation training based on various tools related to open badges and other tools that not necessarily are open, but also gamification is quite popular. OECD has shown that the use of micro-credentials in platforms such as MOOC has grown consistently. Here you can see the results of the report published in the report from this year, but it is also important to certify alternative qualifications. And the research, not only in Poland, shows that some platforms can very positive impact on employability. And they are not only need to be massive, but also tailor-made, because then they provide efficient vocational education and training and respond to the needs of the labor market. Longer courses usually bring better results, but they are also more expensive and less accessible for all of those who need to improve some of their qualifications or to slightly requalify, rescale. But we can also see a relationship with it relates to the previous experiences and education of people who participate in training. And the biggest challenges for Poland are legal changes that are needed because the micro-credentials are still not present in Polish legislation, and they will impact on the existing structure and tradition of education systems. And another challenge will be recognition and perception of appreciation of micro-credential among employers. And for example, 20 years ago, two-cycle education was not recognized or acknowledged in Poland because the master's degree was considered a qualification, and bachelor's degree not necessarily was seen as a higher education qualification. It has taken some time to change that. Obviously, this forms some challenges for formal education and Polish qualifications framework. And the biggest challenge can be the recognition of informal learning, because this is the real weakness of Polish system of education. There are so many solutions. This system is very flexible, which poses even greater challenge, and it can also be used by dishonest competition of centers who are more of a printing mills of certificates than training institutions. And this may also mean that lifelong learning will just be reduced to just basic needs of a labor market. And you should remember that you can use micro-credentials on a much broader scale. And another challenge is quality assurance of these micro-credentials, which are so varied and issued by different entities and in different areas. So in order to make them useful, micro-credential must be linked to career guidance and call for the reform of vocational education and training in Poland, especially in terms of vocational education and crafts. And it is time for initial conclusions. Well, micro-credentials will not replace formal education system and formal qualifications, but they may supplement them. They require the development of a system based on trusted entities. Not everything can be a micro-credential, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't follow different paths of training or retraining. So maybe digital badges are a good solution, and micro-credential have a potential for raising motivation to learn by some people, but not all of them. So this is the question of trust and funding. And as I have mentioned before, micro-credential can limit costs of upskilling or reskilling that is needed in a given job. It can also be a tool that will facilitate the transparency and communication between subsystems of education and training. So this is all from me. The last slide presents the materials that you can use. These are quite recent studies and publications. So if you need to learn more about micro-credentials, last year, together with a friend of mine, with my colleague, we wrote an article for Versa, which is available on the EVET website. Thank you so much, Jacek Lewicki. Do you have any questions to our speaker? Because we have a minute. Well, thank you so much. We have successfully presented the hybrid presentation, online presentation, and we are continuing our forum, and we want to thank Dr. Nowakowski for